Some of us have walked so far into the wilderness of our own making that we forget what it feels like to be needed. For 20 years, Tom Briggs had lived alone in the Colorado mountains, convinced his days of mattering to anyone were long behind him. At 59, he figured life had already delivered its verdicts on the kind of man he was. Then, one cold February evening, he found a wounded puma caught in a steel trap. Most people would have walked away, but Tom saw something in those desperate amber eyes that called to his own broken places. He spent hours freeing her, cleaning her wounds with gentle hands that hadn't shown tenderness in decades. By morning, the puma was gone. But what she left behind on his cabin porch would change everything Tom thought he knew about second chances and whether God still had plans for an old hermit's heart. What do you think that grateful mother left for the man who saved her life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a forgotten prayer against the backdrop of Highback Ridge, its weathered logs bearing witness to 20 winters of silence and solitude. Tom Briggs had built it with his own hands in those first desperate months after everything fell apart, when the weight of his failures had driven him so deep into the Colorado wilderness that even the ghosts of his past couldn't follow. The morning sun cast long shadows through frost-covered windows, illuminating dust motes that danced, like memories he couldn't quite catch. On the kitchen table, turned face down, sat a framed photograph he hadn't looked at in 5 years, not since that last Christmas when the silence had grown so heavy it nearly crushed him. Some wounds never quite heal. They just learn to live. Quiet. At 59, Tom moved through his morning routine with practiced precision. Coffee first, black and bitter, brewed in the same dented pot he'd carried up from civilization 2 decades ago. Then breakfast, 2 eggs, bacon if he had it, toast made from bread he baked himself every Sunday. The ritual mattered more than the food. It was proof he was still alive, still functioning, still capable of taking care of himself, even if he'd failed so spectacularly at taking care of anyone else. His reflection in the kitchen window showed a man carved from the same granite as the mountains surrounding him. Grey hair hung past his collar because trips to town for haircuts meant conversation, and conversation led to questions he wasn't ready to answer. Deep lines mapped his face, some from squinting against mountain sun, others from the kind of pain that leaves permanent marks. His hands, wrapped around the coffee mug, bore scars from 20 years of splitting wood, hunting game, and building a life designed to keep the world at arm's length. The routine continued after breakfast. Check the woodpile, tend to his small garden, clean his rifle, read from one of the dozen books he rotated through each year. By afternoon, he'd usually head out to check trap lines or hunt for supper. The mountains provided everything he needed, and in return, he asked nothing except solitude. But solitude, Tom had discovered, was a cruel companion. It promised peace and delivered only echoes of your own thoughts, bouncing off the walls of your skull until you couldn't tell memory from imagination, regret from reality. Pete Morrison ran the supply store in Cedar Falls, the closest thing to civilization within 50 miles. Once a month, Tom would make the treacherous drive down the mountain road to stock up on coffee, ammunition, and staples he couldn't grow or hunt himself. Pete was pushing 70, and had the good sense not to pry into other men's business, which made him about as close to a friend as Tom allowed himself. "Storm's coming tonight," Pete would say, ringing up purchases with hands gnarled by arthritis. "Radio says it might be a big one." Tom would nod, count out exact change, and drive home before conversation could venture into dangerous territory. Pete's wife had died 3 years back, and sometimes Tom caught a look in the old man's eyes that suggested he understood something about the weight of silence, the burden of empty rooms and unspoken words. Then there was Sarah Chen, the veterinarian, who'd moved to Cedar Falls 5 years ago to take over Doc Peterson's practice. She was maybe 45, with gentle hands and sharp eyes that seemed to see more than most folks were comfortable sharing. Twice, when Tom had injured himself badly enough to require medical attention, once with an axe that slipped while splitting wood, another time when a spooked deer had knocked him down a rocky slope. Sarah had patched him up with minimal questions and maximum competence. "You should come into town more often," she'd said, after stitching up the gash on his forearm. "Isolation isn't natural for people. We're social creatures whether we like it or not." Tom had thanked her, paid his bill, and driven home through a blizzard that matched the storm in his chest. Social creatures. The phrase had haunted him for weeks because deep down he knew she was right. Deep down he remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere, to someone. Before the cabin, before the mountains, before the self-imposed exile, Tom Briggs had been a different man entirely. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, earned a Bronze Star and Purple Heart, and come home to marry his high school sweetheart Mary Ellen Patterson. They'd settled in Denver, where Tom used his military training to become a police officer, then detective, then sergeant in charge of a narcotics unit with a reputation for getting results. He'd been good at his job, maybe too good. The kind of cop who brought work home in his head if not in his briefcase, who saw the worst of humanity often enough to start looking for it everywhere. Mary Ellen had tried to reach him, tried to pull him back from the edge. He didn't even realize he was walking. But Tom had been too busy fighting other people's demons to notice his own were winning. Their son Danny had been born in 1978, a perfect baby with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn chin. For a few years, fatherhood had anchored Tom to something larger than duty and rage. He'd coached Little League, taught Danny to fish and hunt, attended every school play and parent-teacher conference. On the surface, they'd looked like the perfect American family, but surfaces could hide depths of rot. The end came on a Tuesday in October 1995. Danny was 17, a senior in high school with college acceptance letters starting to arrive. He'd been driving home from his girlfriend's house when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head-on. The impact killed him instantly, which the emergency room doctor said was a mercy. Danny hadn't suffered, but suffering, it turned out, was reserved for the living. Mary Ellen had tried to keep them together, tried to channel her grief into something constructive. She'd started a scholarship fund in Danny's name, volunteered with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, threw herself into causes that might honor their son's memory. Tom, meanwhile, had retreated into work with a fury that frightened even his fellow officers. He'd worked 18-hour days, taken every overtime shift, volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. If he stayed busy enough, tired enough, maybe the pain couldn't catch him. It caught him anyway. The drinking started gradually. A beer or two after particularly bad days, then a 6-pack, then whatever it took to quiet the voices in his head that kept asking why he couldn't protect. The one person who'd mattered most. Mary Ellen had begged him to get help, to talk to someone, to stop running from the grief they should have been facing together. Instead, he'd run further. The final straw came on their 25th wedding anniversary. Mary Ellen had made reservations at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, bought a new dress, done everything she could to create a moment of connection in the wasteland their marriage had become. Tom had promised to be there, sworn. He'd leave work early for once, but a drug bust had gone sideways, shots were fired, and by the time the paperwork was finished and the adrenaline had faded, it was past midnight. He'd found Mary Ellen asleep at the kitchen table, still wearing her new dress, the anniversary dinner cold and untouched on the counter. She'd filed for divorce the next morning. The settlement had been generous. Mary Ellen took the house, half his pension, and what remained of his heart. Tom had kept his truck, his guns, and enough savings to disappear, which was exactly what he'd done. He'd driven west until he found this ridge, this piece of forgotten country where a man could build a life that touched no one else's. The cabin had taken him 6 months to construct, working from dawn to dusk with the focused intensity of someone building an ark against a flood that had already come. When it was finished, He'd unplugged from civilization as completely as a man could manage in the modern world. No phone, no internet, no television. Just the mountains, the seasons, and the endless work of staying alive in a place that demanded competence and punished weakness. For 20 years, it had been enough. The photograph on the kitchen table, the one he kept face down like a sleeping giant he didn't dare wake, showed the three of them at Danny's high school graduation. Mary Ellen in her blue dress, radiant with pride. Danny, in his cap and gown, grinning at something his father had just said. And Tom, younger and softer around the edges, with his arm around his son's shoulders and love written across his face like a man who believed the good times would never end. He'd carried that picture with him when he fled to the mountains, but he hadn't looked at it in 5 years. Couldn't bear to see the man he used to be, the father who'd failed to protect his child, the husband who'd let grief turn him into a stranger in his own life. Some nights, especially in winter when the silence pressed against the cabin walls, like something alive and hungry, Tom wondered if this was what he deserved. A life measured in empty days and quiet disappointments, a slow fade toward irrelevance and death. Other nights, usually after he'd been drinking from the bottle of whiskey he kept hidden behind the flour canister, he wondered if Mary Ellen ever, and thought about him, if she'd remarried, if she'd found a way to be happy again. He hoped she had. That, at least, would mean something good had come from his exile. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass like tiny ghosts. Weather was coming, just like Pete had predicted. Tom banked the fire, checked his supplies, and settled into his evening routine of solitude and contemplation. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful isolation, another 24 hours of keeping the world at a safe distance. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would also bring 3 small lives that would change everything he thought he understood. About second chances, redemption, and whether a man's worst mistakes could ever truly be forgiven. The first sound that penetrated Tom's consciousness wasn't the usual mountain quiet he'd grown accustomed to over 2 decades. It was something else entirely, soft, insistent, and utterly foreign to the carefully ordered world he'd built. His eyes opened to grey dawn light filtering through frost-covered windows, and for a moment he lay still, listening to what sounded impossibly like crying, but not human crying. Something smaller, more fragile, and infinitely more desperate. Tom sat up in his narrow bed, every instinct honed by years of military service and police work, suddenly alert. The sound was coming from outside, from his front porch. He pulled on boots and a heavy coat, grabbed his rifle, and stepped into the bitter February morning. What he found there stopped him cold. Nestled in a carefully woven basket made of pine needles and soft mountain grass sat 3 of the tiniest creatures he'd ever seen. Puma cubs, their eyes still sealed shut, their golden fur so fine it looked like down. They were no bigger than house cats, mewling and squirming against each other for warmth, their small mouths opening and closing in search of milk that wasn't there. Tom's rifle clattered to the porch as he knelt beside the basket, his weathered hands hovering over the cubs as if they might disappear if he touched them. The craftsmanship of their nest was extraordinary. Pine needles woven together with grass and strips of bark, lined with the softest moss and what looked like fur from the mother's own coat. It was a cradle made with the kind of care that could only come from desperate love. The mother Puma, the one he'd freed from the steel trap just yesterday evening. She'd been magnificent even in her pain, a full-grown female, probably 6 feet from nose to tail, with amber eyes that held intelligence and dignity despite the cruel metal teeth biting into her left hind leg. The trap had been set illegally, probably by some weekend hunter from Denver who didn't care about seasons or regulations. Tom had found her just as the sun was setting, following the sound of her low, anguished growls through the timber. Most men would have shot her and walked away. A trapped puma was dangerous, unpredictable, capable of taking a man's arm off even, while wounded. But something in those amber eyes had called to the broken places in Tom's heart, had spoken to him in a language he thought he'd forgotten. This was a mother separated from her cubs, a creature fighting not just for her own survival, but for something larger and more important than herself. Tom had spent 3 hours working her free, speaking to her in low, gentle tones while she watched him with wariness, gradually giving way to something that might have been trust. He'd cleaned her wounds with water from his canteen, applied antiseptic from his first aid kit, and bound the injured leg with strips torn from his own shirt. When she'd finally limped away into the darkness, disappearing like a ghost between the trees, he'd thought that was the end of it. One small act of mercy in a world that seemed to have forgotten what mercy looked like. Now, staring down at her cubs, he understood that it had been only the beginning. The smallest of the three was struggling more than the others, its mewling weaker, its movements less coordinated. Newborn animals could survive only hours without milk, and Tom had no idea how long these cubs had been on his porch. The mother must have given birth recently, probably yesterday after he'd freed her, then carried her babies here in her mouth one by one, a journey that must have been agony with her injured leg. But why here? Why trust the human who'd helped her with the most precious things in her world? Tom's chest tightened as he reached for the smallest cub, his hands shaking not from cold, but from an emotion he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. The tiny creature fit in his palm like a handful of golden silk, its heart beating so fast he could feel it through its ribs. When he lifted it close to his face, it nuzzled against his cheek with instinctive trust that nearly broke him. For the first time in 40 years, Thomas Briggs began to cry. The tears came hard and fast, 20 years of suppressed grief pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. He cried for Danny, for the father he'd failed to be when it mattered most. He cried for Mary Ellen, for the love he'd been too broken to accept or return. He cried for the mother Puma, who'd trusted him with her children when she had nowhere else to turn. And he cried for himself, for the shell of a man he'd become, hiding in these mountains while life passed him by. But even as he wept, a part of his mind was already calculating what needed to be done. These cubs would die without immediate care. They needed warmth, they needed food, and they needed it now. Tom gathered the basket and carried it inside, setting it near the wood stove where the radiant heat would keep the cubs warm. The largest of the three was already more active, trying to crawl over its siblings in search of milk. The middle one seemed stronger than its appearance suggested, its mewling more insistent and demanding. But the smallest, God, it was so tiny, barely moved at all. He'd never raised anything more complex than a vegetable garden, but instinct and desperation drove him to action. First, warmth. He stoked the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably hot. Then food. But what did newborn Pumas eat besides their mother's milk? His mind raced through possibilities. Cow's milk would make them sick, but maybe goat's milk if he could find it. Or kitten formula from the veterinary clinic in town. Sarah Chen would know what to do, would have the supplies and knowledge to keep these cubs alive. But taking them to her would mean exposure, questions, and almost certainly the involvement of wildlife services. Colorado law was strict about keeping wild animals, especially predators. The cubs would be taken away, probably euthanized or sent to some zoo where they'd spend their lives in cages. The thought of those tiny creatures ending up behind bars made Tom's stomach clench. No, whatever it took, whatever laws he had to break, he wouldn't let that happen. But first, he had to keep them alive long enough to figure out a plan. The drive to Cedar Falls had never felt longer. Tom left the cubs bundled in blankets near the stove, praying they'd still be breathing when he returned. His ancient pickup truck groaned and wheezed down the mountain road, its chains biting into the snow-packed surface as he navigated hairpin turns he usually took with careful patience. Today, patience was a luxury he couldn't afford. Pete Morrison looked up from his newspaper as the bell above the door announced Tom's arrival. Back soon, aren't you? Didn't expect to see you for another 3 weeks. Need some things, Tom said, grabbing a shopping basket and heading for the back corner where Pete kept a small selection of pet supplies. You got any kitten formula? Pete's bushy eyebrows rose. Kitten formula? Tom, you don't strike me as the cat type. Found some strays, Tom said, loading his basket with cans of kitten milk replacer, baby bottles, and a heating pad. Figured I'd try to help them out. It wasn't. Entirely a lie, which made it easier to meet Pete's curious gaze. The old man shrugged and went back to his newspaper. Sarah Chen might have better supplies if you're serious about this. Veterinary-grade stuff. I'll manage with what you've got. Tom paid in cash and drove home even faster than he'd come, his heart hammering against his ribs as he imagined finding the cubs cold and still beside his wood stove. But when he burst through the cabin door, all three were still moving, still crying their tiny hearts out for the mother who couldn't come. Back to them. The next several hours passed in a blur of trial and error that tested every ounce of patience Tom had ever possessed. Mixing the formula to the right consistency, heating it to the proper temperature, coaxing milk down 3 tiny throats that seemed designed to reject anything that wasn't their mother's nipple. The smallest cub was the most challenging, barely able to manage a few drops at a time before falling back into exhausted sleep. But gradually, miraculously, they began to respond. The largest cub, Tom found himself thinking of it as Big Boy, though he couldn't tell yet if it was male or female, latched onto the bottle with surprising strength. The middle one, more delicate but determined, needed more coaxing, but eventually got the hang of it. And the smallest, the one that had nearly broken his heart with its fragility, managed to take enough formula to quiet its crying. As the afternoon wore on and the cubs settled into milk-drunk sleep, Tom sat in his wooden chair and watched them with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Tenderness, maybe. Protectiveness, certainly. But underneath those surface feelings was something deeper and more dangerous. A stirring of purpose he hadn't felt since Danny was small. These tiny creatures needed him. Not just his help, but him specifically. The mother Puma had chosen him, had trusted him with the most precious gifts she could offer. And for the first time in 20 years, Thomas Briggs was responsible for something other than his own survival. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a quiet sense of wonder. By evening, the cubs had established a rough feeding schedule every 2 hours, like human babies. Tom set his alarm clock and prepared for what he knew would be a sleepless night. As he settled the basket beside his bed, where he could reach it easily, he realized his entire life had changed in the space of a single day. He was a father again. The first week passed in a haze of exhaustion and desperate improvisation. Tom had thought he understood what it meant to be tired, from his military days, from pulling double shifts as a cop, from the bone-deep weariness that had driven him to these mountains 20 years ago. But none of that compared to the relentless demands of 3 newborn Puma cubs who needed feeding every 2 hours around the clock. His alarm clock became both savior and tormentor, jolting him awake at midnight, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., and dawn each time. He'd stumble from his bed to warm bottles of formula on the wood stove, then spend the next hour coaxing milk into tiny mouths that seemed to have their own opinions about when and how much they wanted to eat. The smallest cub, he'd started calling her Little Bit, though he still wasn't certain of her sex, remained the most challenging, often taking 40 minutes to consume what her siblings finished in 10. But they were growing stronger. By the third day, their eyes were starting to open, just slits at first, revealing glimpses of blue that would eventually turn to amber like their mother's. By the 5th day, they were more coordinated, able to lift their heads and orient toward the sound of his voice. By the 7th day, they were beginning to show distinct personalities that both charmed and worried him. Big Boy was bold and demanding, the first to the bottle and the last to settle down afterward. He was also the most physically advanced, already trying to stand on wobbly legs and explore beyond the confines of their basket. The middle cub, Sweet girl, he'd decided, based on her more delicate features and gentler temperament, was clever and patient, often figuring out the mechanics of feeding before her brothers, but willing to wait her turn. And Little Bit, fragile, a spun glass but stubbornly determined, had developed the loudest cry of the three when she wanted attention. The hand-carved feeding bottles had been born of necessity rather than sentiment. The store-bought bottles from Pete's supply shop were too large, their nipples too hard for such small mouths. Tom had spent an entire afternoon whittling proper-sized bottles from pine, boring out the centers with heated nails, and fashioning soft nipples from strips of rubber he'd salvaged from old inner tubes. The work had been painstaking, requiring the kind of patience and precision he hadn't applied to anything in years. But as he'd shaped each bottle, testing the flow rate by sucking formula through the makeshift nipples himself, Tom had found something unexpected: satisfaction. Not just the practical pleasure of solving a problem, but something deeper. He was creating tools for nurturing, objects whose sole purpose was to sustain life. His hands, scarred from decades of violence and isolation, were learning to build instead of destroy. The cub's basket had been moved from the kitchen to a corner of the main room where Tom could see them from anywhere in the cabin. He'd built a low fence around it to contain them as they grew more mobile, and lined the enclosed area with the softest materials he could find: old wool blankets, towels he'd never used, even a sweater that had belonged to Danny and somehow survived the purge that followed his divorce. Watching them sleep between feedings became Tom's new meditation. The way they curled together for warmth, their tiny paws sometimes twitching as they dreamed whatever dreams newborn predators might have. Little Bit always ended up in the middle, protected by her larger siblings, who seemed to sense her fragility. Sweet Girl was the groomer, already showing signs of the fastidious nature that would serve her well in the wild. And Big Boy was the explorer, the first to wake from naps and investigate new sounds or smells. The feeding schedule was brutal, but it was also the closest thing to purpose Tom had felt in 20 years. When the alarm went off at 2 in the morning and his body screamed in protest, he found he didn't resent the interruption. Instead, there was something almost sacred about moving through the quiet cabin, preparing bottles by lamplight, and watching 3 small creatures trust him completely for their survival. It reminded him, inevitably, of Danny's infancy, the midnight feedings, the gentle weight of a baby against his chest, the profound responsibility of being someone's entire world. He'd forgotten how it felt to be needed so completely, so unconditionally. These cubs didn't care about his failures, his guilt, or the reasons he'd hidden himself away in these mountains. They cared only that he showed up when they were hungry, that his hands were gentle when he held them, and that his voice was steady and calm when they were frightened. The parallels to human parenthood were both comforting and painful. Comforting, because some instincts, it seemed, transcended species. The protective urge, the fierce tenderness, the way his entire existence had suddenly reorganized itself around their needs. Painful because it reminded him of everything he'd lost, everything he'd failed to protect when it mattered most. But there were differences too, important ones that kept him grounded in the present rather than drowning in the past. These cubs were wild creatures who would eventually return to the wilderness where they belonged. His job wasn't to domesticate them, but to keep them alive long enough to become the predators nature intended. That knowledge was both liberating and heartbreaking. He could love them completely because he would have to let them go. The practical challenges were immense. Kitten formula was expensive, and he was going through 2 cans a day. His monthly trip to Pete's store had become a weekly necessity, which meant more exposure and more chances for someone to ask the wrong questions. He'd started varying his route to town, taking the longer but less traveled back roads to avoid running into the same people too often. Storage was another problem. The cubs were already outgrowing their basket, and their appetites were increasing daily. Soon they'd need solid food, space to move and play, and God help him, litter boxes or some equivalent. The cabin that had seemed spacious for one hermit was starting to feel cramped with 4 occupants, even if 3 of them weighed less than a house cat. But the biggest challenge was emotional. Every day that passed strengthened the bonds between them, made the inevitable separation harder to contemplate. When Little Bit mewled in distress and quieted only when he picked her up, when Big Boy purred against his chest after feeding, when Sweet Girl opened her eyes and seemed to look directly into his soul, those moments chipped away at the careful walls he'd built around his heart. He was falling in love with them, and that love was both his salvation and his terror. Tut! Cubs's eyes fully opened on their 8th day with him, revealing the deep blue that would gradually shift to amber over the coming weeks. They began to focus on his face during feedings, their tiny heads tracking his movements around the cabin. Big Boy was the first to purr, a sound so small and perfect it brought tears to Tom's eyes. Sweet Girl was the first to attempt grooming, her rough little tongue trying to clean his fingers after feeding time. And Little Bit was the first to fall asleep in his hands and stay asleep when he tried to put her back in the basket, forcing him to hold her for an entire hour while she napped against his palm. By the end of the 2nd week, they were trying to stand on unsteady legs, their needle-sharp claws digging into the blankets for purchase. Tom found himself baby-proofing the cabin, moving anything breakable or dangerous out of reach, securing cabinet doors, and covering electrical outlets with tape. The irony wasn't lost on him, after 20 years of living alone with no consideration for safety except his own. He was suddenly seeing his home through the eyes of creatures who could find danger in a dust bunny. The feeding bottles had evolved too. As the cubs grew stronger, Tom carved larger versions, refining the design with each iteration. He added small grooves near the top for easier gripping, adjusted the nipple size for different flow rates, and even carved their initials into the wood, B for Big Boy, S for Sweet Girl, and L for Little Bit. The bottles had become more than tools. They were artifacts of his devotion, physical proof that someone cared enough about these small lives to spend hours creating exactly what they needed. By the 3rd week, the cubs had outgrown their basket entirely. Big Boy was the first to figure out how to climb over the low fence Tom had built, tumbling onto the cabin floor with more enthusiasm than grace. Within hours, all 3 had mastered the escape, turning Tom's orderly retreat into a playground of epic proportions. He'd find them everywhere, under the kitchen table, batting at his bootlaces, behind the wood stove where the warmth drew them, like magnets, or clustered around his chair legs while he tried to read. Little Bit had developed an alarming fondness for climbing, her tiny claws giving her purchase on surfaces that seemed impossible to navigate. More than once, Tom had looked up from his coffee to find her halfway up the log wall, mewing pitifully because she couldn't figure out how to get down. The cabin that had housed one solitary man in perfect order for 20 years was now a chaos of scattered toys, milk-stained blankets, and tiny paw prints on every surface. Tom should have been frustrated. Instead, he found himself smiling more often than he had since Danny was small. The cubs' appetites had graduated from formula to a mixture that included small amounts of raw meat. Tom had started with ground beef from his monthly supplies, but quickly realized he needed to hunt more, frequently to provide the fresh protein 3 growing predators required. His trap lines, unused for weeks while he focused on round-the-clock feedings, had to be reset and expanded. Each morning after their dawn feeding, he'd venture out into the wilderness that surrounded his cabin, tracking rabbits and squirrels with skills honed over 2 decades of mountain living. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was hunting to feed creatures that would eventually become hunters themselves, apex predators capable of bringing down prey 10 times their current size. But watching them play with their food was pure joy. Sweet girl had figured out how to bat small pieces of meat around before eating them, perfecting hunting behaviors that were written into her genetic code. Big Boy approached meals with his characteristic directness, devouring everything in sight and then looking around for more. And Little Bit, still the smallest and most cautious, would carefully inspect each piece before accepting it, as if quality control was her contribution to the household. The cubs were also becoming more active during daylight hours, their natural crepuscular rhythms starting to assert themselves. They'd play in bursts of manic energy, wrestling with each other and attacking imaginary prey with the intensity of creatures born to hunt. Then they'd collapse into exhausted sleep piles, usually somewhere inconvenient, like the middle of Tom's bed or directly in front of the wood stove, where he needed to add logs. It was during one of these play sessions that Tom discovered the wooden toy. He'd been searching the cabin's storage areas for materials to build a larger enclosure, something that would give the cubs room to move without destroying what remained of his orderly existence. The attic space above his bedroom was cramped and dusty, filled with boxes he'd packed 20 years ago and never opened since. Most contained practical items, extra clothing, books, tools he'd thought he might need, but never used. But in the corner, wrapped in an old wool blanket, was a box marked Danny's Room in Mary Ellen's careful handwriting. Tom's hands shook as he lifted the lid, revealing treasures he'd forgotten he'd saved. A baseball glove, worn soft from countless games of catch. School photos spanning kindergarten through senior year, showing his son's face evolving from chubby-cheeked child to handsome young man. A collection of Boy Scout badges and merit ribbons from various competitions, and nestled at the bottom, a small wooden horse he'd carved for Danny's 5th birthday. The toy was simple, but carefully crafted, sanded smooth and painted with the kind of attention to detail that came from love rather than skill. Danny had carried it everywhere for months, creating elaborate adventures where the horse saved entire kingdoms from imaginary dragons. Tom remembered the weight of his son's small body against his chest as he told bedtime stories about the brave wooden steed. Remembered Danny's sleepy voice, insisting that the horse needed a name, a history, a family of its own. Now, sitting in the dusty attic with the sounds of 3 Puma cubs playing below, Tom felt the past and present collide with devastating clarity. He'd been a father once. He'd carved toys and told stories and believed his love was strong enough to keep his child safe from all the world's dangers. He'd been wrong about that last part, catastrophically wrong, but the love itself, that had been real. When he climbed down from the attic, the wooden horse in his pocket, he found the cubs had discovered his boots and were engaged in a fierce battle with the laces. Little Bit had somehow managed to tie herself up in the process, her tiny paws tangled in leather string, while she mewed indignantly for rescue. "Hold on there, Little Bit," he said, kneeling to untangle her. "Let's see if you're interested in something that's supposed to be a toy." He placed the wooden horse on the floor between the 3 cubs, expecting them to ignore it in favor of the bootlaces that had captured their attention. Instead, Sweet Girl approached it cautiously, sniffing the carved surface before batting at it with one paw. When it moved slightly under her touch, all 3 cubs immediately went into hunting mode, pupils dilated, bodies low, tails twitching. With excitement, what followed was an hour of the most elaborate play Tom had ever witnessed. The cubs took turns stalking the wooden horse, pouncing on it with theatrical precision, then carrying it around the cabin like a captured trophy. Big Boy claimed it first, proudly parading around with the toy clamped in his jaws. Sweet Girl stole it through cunning and stealth, hiding behind furniture before making her move, and Little Bit, despite her size disadvantage, proved she could hold her own through sheer determination and what appeared to be strategic thinking. Watching them play with Danny's toy should have been heartbreaking. Instead, it felt like benediction. The wooden horse, carved with a father's love and polished smooth by a little boy's hands, was serving its purpose again, bringing joy to children who needed it, creating memories that would outlast the fragile. Creatures making them. That evening, as the cubs settled into their after-dinner nap, Tom found himself studying the framed photograph he kept face down on the kitchen table. For the first time in 5 years, he turned it over and looked at the image of his family at Danny's graduation. The man in that picture seemed like a stranger, younger, hopeful, convinced that the worst thing that could happen was his son leaving for college. But there was something familiar in that man's eyes, something Tom recognized from his own reflection lately. It was the look of someone who had something precious to protect, someone whose days were organized around another creature's needs, someone who understood that love was both the most dangerous and most necessary risk a person could take. The cubs were changing him, he realized. Not just his daily routines or his carefully maintained isolation, but something deeper. They were teaching him to hope again, to care again, to believe that maybe his capacity for love hadn't died with his son or been buried in the ashes of his marriage. Sweet girl stirred in her sleep, making the small chirping sounds that meant she was dreaming. Big boy rolled over and stretched, one tiny paw reaching toward where Tom sat. And Little Bit, the fighter, the survivor, opened one blue eye to check that her human was still there before closing it again with evident satisfaction. Tom carefully turned the photograph face down again, but gently this time, like tucking a child into bed rather than hiding from painful truth. Danny was gone, and no amount of love could bring him back. But love itself, that was still here, still alive, still capable of transforming everything it touched. The knock on his door came at the worst possible moment. Tom was in the middle of the cubs' afternoon feeding, Little Bit balanced in one hand, while he held her bottle with the other, Big Boy and Sweet Girl wrestling at his feet over who got the next turn. The sound of knuckles against wood froze all 4 of them. The cubs, because any unexpected noise triggered their prey instincts, and Tom, because in 20 years of mountain living, no one had ever come to his door unannounced. "Mr. Briggs, it's Sarah Chen from the veterinary clinic. I need to speak with you." Tom's blood turned to ice water. Sarah's voice carried the professional tone he remembered from their previous encounters, but underneath it was something else. Determination mixed with concern. She knew. Somehow, she'd figured out what he was hiding, moving with desperate efficiency. Tom scooped up Big Boy and Sweet Girl, carried all 3 cubs to his bedroom, and shut them inside with their toys and a bowl of water. Their indignant mewing was muffled by the closed door, but if Sarah listened carefully, she'd certainly hear it. "Just a minute," he called, running his hands through his hair and trying to look like a man who hadn't spent the last month raising illegal wildlife in his living room. He opened the door to find Sarah standing on his porch, snowflakes dusting her dark hair and a look of barely contained frustration on her face. "Dr. Chen," he said, stepping aside to let her in before she could freeze. "This is unexpected." "I'm sure it is." Sarah stamped the snow off her boots and looked around the cabin with the practiced eye of someone trained to notice details. Her gaze lingered on the scattered blankets, the wooden feeding bottles drying by the sink, and the distinct scratch marks on his coffee table that could only have been made by very sharp, very small claws. "Pete Morrison is worried about you," she said, shrugging out of her coat. "You've been coming to town every few days, buying unusual supplies, and looking like you haven't slept in weeks. He asked me to check on you." "I'm fine," Tom said, positioning himself between Sarah and the bedroom door, where the cubs' protests were growing louder. "Just a bout of insomnia. Nothing to worry about." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Insomnia that requires kitten formula and baby bottles?" From the bedroom came a particularly loud yowl of outrage from Big Boy, followed by what sounded like Sweet Girl knocking something over. Sarah's head turned toward the sound, and Tom watched her expression shift from suspicion to certainty. "Thomas," she said quietly, using his full name for the first time since he'd known her. "What do you have in that bedroom?" The moment stretched between them like a taut wire. Tom could lie, could insist it was nothing, could try to bluff his way through this confrontation. But looking into Sarah's eyes, intelligent, compassionate, and absolutely immovable, he realized the game was over. 3 Puma cubs, he said. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, her expression was a mixture of exasperation and something that might have been admiration. How old? About 5 weeks now. Found them on my porch when they were newborns. Jesus, Thomas, do you have any idea how illegal this is? How dangerous? Another crash from the bedroom, followed by a series of chirping sounds that meant the cubs were calling for their human. Sarah looked toward the door again, and despite her obvious frustration, Tom caught a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "They're probably scared," he said. "They've never been separated from me for this long. Show me." It wasn't a request. Sarah had shifted into veterinarian mode, and Tom recognized the tone of someone who expected to be obeyed. He opened the bedroom, to reveal 3 golden cubs who had apparently decided that his absence was unacceptable. Big Boy was standing on his hind legs against the door, his front paws scratching at the wood. Sweet Girl had claimed the middle of his bed and was calling to him with increasing volume. And Little Bit had somehow climbed onto his dresser and was pacing back and forth like a tiny sentinel. The moment they saw him, all 3 cubs rushed toward the door, mewing and purring and generally making it clear that being locked away was not acceptable behavior from their human. "My God," Sarah breathed, dropping to her knees as the cubs swarmed around Tom's legs. "They're beautiful. They're trouble," Tom said, but his tone was gentle as he scooped up Little Bit, who had been trying to climb his pants leg to reach. His hands. "And they're getting bigger every day." Sarah was studying the cubs with professional interest, noting their size, their condition, their obvious health and vitality. "You've done an incredible job with them. They look perfect. Well-fed, well-socialized, no signs of stress or malnutrition." "I've been trying," Tom said, settling into his chair with Little Bit in his lap, while Big Boy and Sweet Girl investigated this new human who smelled interestingly of other animals. "But I'm in over my head. I know that. You can't keep them. Thomas, surely you understand that." The words hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting them. "I know. They're wild animals. No matter how well you've cared for them, they belong in the wilderness. And the law is very clear about keeping native predators without permits." "What happens if I report them?" Tom asked, though he dreaded the answer. Wildlife services would take them immediately. At their age, if they haven't been properly prepared for release, taught to hunt, to fear humans, to recognize their own species, they'd probably be euthanized or sent to a zoo. Sweet Girl had decided that Sarah's shoelaces needed investigation and was batting at them with the intense focus of a creature born to hunt. Despite her obvious concern about the situation, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the cubs' antics. "There might be another option," she said slowly. "There's a wildlife rehabilitation facility about 2 hours south of here. They specialize in preparing orphaned predators for release back into the wild. If the cubs are healthy and haven't been too imprinted on humans—" "They're imprinted on me," Tom interrupted. "They think I'm their father." Sarah looked up from Sweet Girl's play to study Tom's face. What she saw there, the love, the fierce protectiveness, the barely controlled desperation, seemed to surprise her. "You really care about them. They're my children," Tom said simply. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Sarah was clearly wrestling with competing impulses: her duty to report illegal wildlife keeping, her recognition of the genuine bond between Tom and the cubs, and her professional understanding of what these animals needed to survive. Finally, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a business card. It was cream-colored with official-looking letterhead: Colorado Division of Wildlife, Randy Morrison, Wildlife Officer. "He's been asking questions in town," Sarah said, "about unusual animal activity, people buying strange supplies, reports of large cat tracks near residential areas." "Someone saw you coming and going from Pete's store and mentioned it to him." Tom's stomach dropped. "How long do I have?" I don't know, maybe days, maybe weeks. But Thomas, you need to understand, if he finds those cubs here, you'll face serious charges. Hefty fines, possible jail time, and the cubs will be confiscated immediately. Big Boy had worked up the courage to approach Sarah directly, sniffing her hand with the cautious curiosity of a young predator learning to navigate the world. When she slowly extended her fingers for him to investigate, he bumped his head against her palm in the universal feline request for affection. "They trust you completely," Sarah observed, gently scratching behind Big Boy's ears. "That's beautiful and terrifying at the same time." "What would you do?" Tom asked. "If they were yours?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching Sweet Girl stalk an imaginary prey across the cabin floor while Little Bit purred in Tom's lap. "I'd want to keep them forever," she admitted, "but I'd also want what was best for them, even if it broke my heart." After she left, Tom sat in his chair holding Little Bit, while Big Boy and Sweet Girl played at his feet. The cabin felt smaller, somehow, as if the outside world had pushed its way inside and contaminated the sanctuary he'd created. The wildlife officer's business card lay on his kitchen table like a coiled snake, representing everything he feared most. The cubs were changing rapidly now, their blue eyes deepening toward amber, and their playful wrestling taking on the intensity of creatures learning to be predators. At 8 weeks old, they were the size of house cats, their needle-sharp claws capable of shredding furniture and their hunting instincts strong enough that no moving object in the cabin was safe from attack. Tom's bootlaces had become their mortal enemies. His reading glasses disappeared daily, usually found later being batted around under furniture, and his morning coffee routine now required constant vigilance, as Sweet Girl had developed an alarming talent for leaping onto the kitchen counter from seemingly impossible distances. But it was their growing need for space that worried him most. The cabin that had seemed adequate when they were tiny, mewling creatures now felt like a prison. Big Boy spent hours pacing the perimeter of the main room, his body language suggesting frustration with the artificial boundaries. Sweet Girl had taken to climbing the log walls, her claws leaving deep gouges in the wood as she sought higher vantage points. And Little Bit, still the smallest but no longer fragile, had begun exhibiting the restless energy of a caged predator. They needed territory. They needed room to run, to hunt, to express the wild nature that was asserting itself more strongly each day. But Tom couldn't let them outside. Not with Wildlife Officer Morrison asking questions in town, not with the risk that they might be seen by hunters or hikers, not with the growing possibility that they might venture too far from the cabin and never return. The conflict was tearing him apart. 3 days after Sarah's visit, Tom made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Using materials salvaged from his old hunting cabin and purchased with increasingly frequent trips to Pete's store, he began building an outdoor enclosure attached to the cabin's back wall. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would give the cubs access to fresh air, natural sunlight, and enough space to express some of their predatory behaviors. The construction project consumed his days and haunted his nights. He worked from dawn until dusk, digging post holes in the half-frozen ground, stretching heavy-gauge fencing, and building a roof structure that would keep the cubs contained while allowing them to experience weather and seasons. The enclosure was large, 30 feet by 20 feet, with multiple levels and climbing structures built from fallen logs. But even as he worked, Tom knew it wasn't enough. No enclosure, however well designed, could provide what these cubs truly needed. They were mountain lions, apex predators whose ancestors had roamed territories spanning hundreds of square miles. Confining them to even the most generous cage was like trying to hold lightning in a bottle. The cubs watched his construction efforts with intense interest, pressing their faces against the windows and chattering at him whenever he appeared in their line of sight. They could sense something important was happening, something that involved them, and their excitement was both touching and devastating. It was while installing the gate mechanism that Tom found himself thinking about Danny's baseball glove. He'd discovered it that morning while searching for tools in the storage boxes, nestled beneath his son's Boy Scout uniforms and school photographs. The leather was still supple despite 20 years of storage, bearing the impressions of countless catches and the faint scent of neat's foot oil and summer grass. Holding it brought back a flood of memories, teaching Danny to field ground balls in their Denver backyard, the pride in his son's eyes when he made his first unassisted double play, the countless hours spent playing catch while Mary Ellen called them in for dinner. Baseball had been their shared language, the one arena where Tom felt he'd succeeded as a father. Danny had been a good player, not great, but solid, the kind of kid coaches loved because he showed up, tried hard, and never complained about playing time. His senior year, he'd been named team captain, an honor that had meant more to him than any trophy or award. The glove had been with him for every game, every practice, every casual backyard session with his father. Now it lay in Tom's hands like a relic from a different life, a physical reminder of his failure to protect the person who'd mattered most. The night Danny died, this glove had been sitting in his locker at school, waiting for spring practice to begin. Tom had retrieved it weeks later, along with the rest of his son's belongings, and carried it with him into exile like a talisman of grief. Looking at it now, with 3 young predators depending on him for everything, Tom felt the weight of history and responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. He'd failed Danny, failed to keep him safe, failed to hold his family together in the aftermath, failed to honor his son's memory with anything more meaningful than 20 years of self-imposed isolation. But these cubs, maybe with them he could get it right. Maybe he could find a way to love without losing, to protect without smothering, to let go when letting go was the most loving thing to do. The enclosure was finished by the end of the week, and the cubs' first venture into the outdoor space was a revelation. Big Boy immediately began patrolling the perimeter, testing the fence with his claws, and investigating every corner with systematic thoroughness. Sweet Girl made a beeline for the tallest climbing structure, scaling it with fluid grace before surveying her expanded domain from above. And Little Bit, after a cautious inspection of the new territory, began what could only be described as a victory dance, rolling in the dirt, pouncing on leaves, and chasing her own tail with uninhibited joy. Watching them experience outdoor space for the first time since their birth should have been pure happiness. Instead, Tom felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. The cubs were thriving, growing into the magnificent predators they were meant to become. But their increasing wildness was also a daily reminder that they didn't belong in his world, no matter how much he wanted to keep them there. The enclosure solved some immediate problems but created new ones. The cubs' outdoor activities were visible from the mountain road that led to other cabins in the area. Hikers occasionally passed through the valley, and hunting season would bring more people into the mountains. Every day that passed increased the chances that someone would spot 3 young mountain lions playing in what was obviously a domestic setting. Moreover, the cubs' vocalizations were getting louder and more frequent. Their contented purrs had evolved into the deeper rumbling sounds that would eventually become the terrifying roars of adult pumas. Their play calls carried farther in the thin mountain air, and their territorial behaviors included scent marking that would attract the attention of any adult pumas in the area. Most concerning of all was their relationship with him. Despite spending time in the outdoor enclosure, the cubs still considered Tom the center of their universe. They called for him when he was out of sight, waited by the gate for his return, and showed no fear or wariness of humans, traits that would make them dangerous to others and vulnerable to hunters if they were ever released. Sarah had been right about the imprinting. These cubs didn't see themselves as wild animals, they saw themselves as Tom's children, with all the dependence and trust that implied. It was beautiful and tragic and completely unsustainable. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late March. Tom was refilling their water containers when he heard voices on the mountain road, a group of early-season hikers discussing wildlife tracks they'd spotted near the creek. One of them mentioned seeing unusual cat sign, bigger than bobcat tracks, but not quite large enough for an adult mountain lion. Probably young ones, another voice said. There's been talk in town about someone keeping illegal pets up this way. Tom's blood ran cold. The cubs were in their enclosure, visible to anyone who walked around to the back of his cabin. If these hikers decided to investigate further, if they took photographs, if they reported what they saw to authorities, he spent the rest of the day in a state of barely controlled panic, keeping the cubs inside and watching the road for any sign of official vehicles. By evening, when no one had come to his door, he'd made a decision that felt like tearing out his own heart. It was time to call the rehabilitation facility. The letter had been sitting in his truck's glove compartment for 3 months, sealed and forgotten beneath maps and registration papers. Tom found it Thursday afternoon while searching for his insurance card, preparing for what might be his last trip to Pete's store before the cubs were transferred. The envelope bore the letterhead of Mountain View Medical Center, Dr. Elizabeth Harper, Oncology Department. His hands shook as he tore it open, though he already knew what it would say. The appointment had been 6 months ago, when the persistent cough and unexplained weight loss had finally driven him to seek medical attention. He'd driven 3 hours to Pueblo to see a doctor who didn't know him, paid cash, and given a false address because he hadn't wanted the results following him home. The diagnosis was as brutal in writing as it had been in Dr. Harper's gentle voice. Stage 4 lung cancer, metastasized to lymph nodes and liver. Inoperable, 6 to 12 months with treatment, 3 to 6 months without. The letter recommended immediate chemotherapy, radiation and enrollment in hospice care for pain management. Tom had walked out of that office and driven straight back to the mountains, shoving the diagnosis into the darkest corner of his mind, where it couldn't touch the carefully ordered world he'd built. The cubs had arrived 2 weeks later, and in the chaos of round-the-clock feedings and the joy of unexpected fatherhood, he'd almost managed to forget he was dying. Now, sitting in his truck with the letter in his hands and 3 young pumas playing, in their enclosure 50 yards away, the reality hit him like a physical blow. He had maybe 3 months left, possibly less. The recent exhaustion he'd attributed to sleep deprivation, the persistent ache in his chest he'd blamed on winter weather, the way food had lost its appeal, all symptoms he'd been ignoring were actually his body's way of telling him time was running out. The cubs would outlive him, even if he kept them, even if he somehow avoided wildlife services and Sarah's well-meaning pressure. He would die and leave them alone in these mountains with no one to care for them. They'd starve, or be shot by hunters, or captured by authorities, and euthanized as dangerous animals that had lost their fear of humans. For the first time since finding the diagnosis, Tom felt grateful for the cancer, because it meant the decision to let them go wasn't about his own selfishness or fear. It was about ensuring they had a future that extended beyond his limited time on Earth. He drove back to the cabin with new purpose, studying the cubs with the intensity of a man trying to memorize every detail. Big Boy's confident swagger as he patrolled his territory. Sweet Girl's graceful leaps from one climbing structure to another. Little Bit's determined efforts to keep up with her larger siblings, her purr loud enough to hear from across the yard. They were beautiful, perfect, alive with the kind of energy that made mortality seem like a cosmic joke. How could something so vibrant and wild be dependent on a dying man? How could life be so cruel as to give him the most meaningful relationship he'd had in 20 years, only to snatch it away just as he was learning to hope again? That evening, as he prepared their dinner, Tom found himself really looking at the cubs for the first time in weeks. Big Boy now weighed at least 15 pounds, his paws large enough to suggest he'd be a massive adult. Sweet Girl was smaller but more agile, her movements fluid and economical like a dancer's. And Little Bit, no longer the fragile creature who'd needed extra time and patience, was developing into a compact predator with the fierce determination of someone who'd had to fight for every advantage. They were 8 weeks old now, no longer babies, but not yet juveniles. In the wild, they would have remained with their mother for another year, learning to hunt and navigate the complex social dynamics of Puma society. Instead, they'd bonded with a broken-down hermit who'd given them love and safety but couldn't prepare them for the lives they were meant to live. The rehabilitation facility would be better for them in every way. Dr. Martinez and her team knew how to raise wild predators, how to maintain the delicate balance between providing necessary care and preserving the wariness that would keep them alive in the wilderness. They had other pumas, proper enclosures, and most importantly, the time and expertise to gradually reduce human contact until the cubs learned to see people as threats rather than family. But knowing the right choice and accepting it were two different things entirely. After the cubs settled into their evening routine, Tom made a decision that felt both necessary and impossible. He would tell them goodbye, even though they couldn't understand the words. He would explain what was happening, why he had to let them go, and hope that somehow his intentions would translate across the species barrier that separated them. He started with Big Boy, lifting the sturdy cub and settling him in his lap, despite the fact that 15 pounds of young Puma was becoming unwieldy for casual holding. "You're going to be magnificent," he said, stroking the cub's golden fur. "Biggest mountain lion these mountains have ever seen, I bet. You've got the confidence for it, the strength. But you're going to need to learn things I can't teach you. How to hunt elk, how to avoid hunters, how to find a mate and raise cubs of your own." Big Boy purred and bumped his head against Tom's chest, completely unaware that this was a farewell speech. Sweet Girl was next, her smaller frame settling into his arms with the trust of a creature who'd never known anything but kindness from human hands. "You're the smart one," Tom told her, "the thinker. That's going to serve you well out there, but you'll need to be careful too, more careful than your brothers. The world isn't safe for predators, especially female predators trying to raise their own families." Finally, Little Bit, his fighter, his miracle, the tiny cub who'd almost died in her first week but had grown into a fierce little predator with an unshakable will to survive. "You're going to be fine," he whispered, holding her close. "Better than fine. You've already proven you can overcome anything. But Little Bit, you have to promise me something. You have to learn to be wild. You have to forget about me and remember that you're a mountain lion, not a pet." The cubs eventually settled into their usual sleep pile, completely unaware that Saturday would bring strangers with transport cages and sedation equipment. Tom sat beside them, memorizing the sound of their breathing, the way they unconsciously sought each other's warmth, the absolute peace of creatures who knew they were safe and loved. The cancer diagnosis changed everything and nothing. He'd already decided to let them go. Now he simply understood why the decision felt so urgent, so necessary, so heartbreakingly right. These cubs deserved decades of wild freedom, not months of increasingly difficult captivity with a man whose body was failing him. But there was something else, something harder to acknowledge. The cubs had saved him in ways that went far beyond giving his life purpose. They'd taught him to love again, to hope again, to believe that second chances were possible, even for someone who'd made every mistake a father could make. In caring for them, he'd learned to forgive himself for failing Danny, for disappointing Mary Ellen, for wasting 20 years in self-imposed exile. They'd given him peace. Not the empty quiet he'd sought in these mountains, but the deep peace that came from knowing you'd done something worthwhile with your time on Earth. He'd raised 3 orphaned predators to health and strength. He'd loved them completely and would let them go gracefully. It was a small legacy, perhaps, but it was his. The revelation that he was dying didn't make Saturday's transfer any easier to contemplate. If anything, it made the prospect of separation more devastating because he now knew for certain that this goodbye would be permanent. There would be no visits to the rehabilitation facility, no updates on their progress, no possibility of seeing them again after their eventual release. But it also brought a strange kind of relief. The cubs would go to people who could give them what they needed, and he would have whatever time remained to remember this unexpected chapter of fatherhood without the daily anxiety of discovery and separation. He could die knowing they were where they belonged, learning to be the wild creatures nature intended, if this was how his story ended, not as a bitter hermit who'd died alone and forgotten, but as a man who'd raised 3 orphaned predators and set them free to live the lives they deserved. Then maybe it was enough. Maybe finally it was enough. Friday morning arrived grey and heavy with the promise of more snow. Tom woke before dawn, not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of the cubs stirring in their sleep pile beside his bed. They'd taken to sleeping in his room over the past week, perhaps sensing some change in his behavior that his conscious mind hadn't acknowledged. Animals, he'd learned, were better at reading emotional weather than most humans. Today was preparation day. Tomorrow, Dr. Martinez and her team would arrive to collect the cubs and transport them to the rehabilitation facility 2 hours south. Tom had exactly 24 hours to accomplish what felt like an impossible task, saying goodbye to the 3 creatures who had become his entire world. But first, there were practical matters to address. Legal documents to review, medical records to organize, and most importantly, a detailed history of each cub's development to pass along to their new caretakers. Dr. Martinez had been specific about the kind of information that would help with their transition, feeding schedules, behavioral quirks, socialization patterns, and any health concerns that had emerged during their time with him. Tom had spent the previous evening writing what amounted to a biography of each cub, documenting everything from Big Boy's preference for morning feedings to Sweet Girl's habit of hiding food for later consumption. The pages read like love letters disguised as veterinary notes, each entry revealing the depth of observation that came from months of devoted attention. The sanctuary documents had arrived by overnight delivery, forms acknowledging the illegal nature of his wildlife keeping, agreements waiving any claim to future contact with the cubs, and releases absolving the rehabilitation facility of responsibility should the cubs prove unsuitable for eventual release. Signing them felt like signing away his parental rights, which in many ways was exactly what he was doing. As the cubs stretched and yawned their way into consciousness, Tom realized this would be their last normal morning together, last feeding in the familiar routine they'd established over 2 months, last play session in the cabin that had become their childhood home. Last evening, settling into sleep with the absolute trust that tomorrow would bring more of the same gentle predictability. Big Boy was first to the food bowls, as always, his adolescent appetite requiring increasingly large portions of the raw meat Tom hunted and prepared. At nearly 20 pounds now, he was showing signs of the massive adult he'd become. Broad paws, thick bone structure, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He'd be the alpha of any territory he eventually claimed, a king of the mountains, whose presence would be felt for miles around. Sweet Girl ate with her characteristic precision, taking time to inspect each piece before consuming it with delicate efficiency. She developed into the most thoughtful of the 3, often pausing in play to observe before acting, calculating risks and rewards with the intelligence that would make her a formidable hunter. Her smaller size would be compensated by cunning and patience. Little Bit attacked her breakfast with the fierce determination that had carried her through those fragile first weeks. No longer the smallest in terms of spirit, she'd grown into a compact predator whose intensity made up for any physical disadvantage. She would be the survivor, the one who'd find a way to thrive in any environment through sheer force of will. Watching them eat, Tom found himself cataloguing details he'd previously taken for granted. The way Big Boy's purr rumbled deep in his chest. The delicate pink of Sweet Girl's nose as she sniffed new scents. The slight crimp in Little Bit's left ear where she'd gotten it caught in the fence during an early climbing adventure. These small imperfections and characteristics were part of what made them individuals rather than just wildlife, part of what made letting them go so devastating. After breakfast, they ventured into the outdoor enclosure for what Tom knew would be their last play session in the space he'd built for them. The cubs had no awareness of impending change, approaching the day with their usual enthusiasm for exploration and mock hunting. They stalked each other through the climbing structures, practiced pouncing techniques on fallen leaves, and engaged in the wrestling matches that were teaching them the physical skills they'd need as adults. Tom sat on the wooden bench he'd placed in one corner of the enclosure, ostensibly to supervise, but really to memorize every moment. The cubs occasionally approached for attention, a head bump against his leg, a brief session of purring in his lap, but they were increasingly focused on each other and their environment rather than their human caretaker. It was healthy development, exactly what they needed for successful rehabilitation, but it still felt like a small betrayal. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah's truck appeared on the mountain road just after lunch, and Tom felt his stomach clench with the familiar anxiety that accompanied any unplanned contact with the outside world. But when she climbed out of her vehicle carrying a large duffel bag and wearing the expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision, he realized this wasn't an official visit. "I brought medical supplies," she said without preamble. "Sedatives, antibiotics, pain medication. Everything Dr. Martinez might need for the transport tomorrow. I also brought something else." She reached into the duffel bag and withdrew a professional-grade camera with a long telephoto lens. "Documentation," she explained. "If we're going to do this, we should record it properly. These cubs represent something extraordinary. Successful hand-rearing of orphaned mountain lions with minimal human imprinting. Dr. Martinez will want detailed photos for her research, and you," she paused, studying his face, "you should have something to remember them by." For the next several hours, Sarah photographed everything. The cubs in their enclosure, playing and exploring with the unconscious grace of young predators. Tom interacting with each one individually. The camera capturing moments of connection that revealed the depth of their bond. The hand-carved feeding bottles, the wooden toys, the carefully constructed environment that had served as their childhood home. "These pictures will matter," Sarah said as she adjusted camera settings for the changing light. "Not just for the scientific record, but for you. Memory is fragile, especially when it carries this much emotional weight. But photographs preserve the truth of what happened here." As evening approached, Tom made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. He would sleep outside tonight, in the enclosure with the cubs, sharing their space one last time before the separation. That would change everything. Sarah helped him carry blankets and a sleeping bag into the outdoor area, setting up a makeshift bed near the climbing structures where the cubs spent most of their time. The cubs were fascinated by this change in routine, investigating the sleeping arrangements with intense curiosity. Big Boy claimed the sleeping bag immediately, kneading it with his paws and purring with satisfaction. Sweet Girl explored the new configuration of their space, testing how the added human bedding affected the familiar geography, and Little Bit appointed herself supervisor, perching on a nearby log to observe the proceedings with the serious expression of someone taking their responsibilities seriously. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, the cubs settled into their usual evening routine with one significant modification. Instead of heading inside to their warm spots near the wood stove, they arranged themselves around Tom's outdoor bed. Big Boy claimed the foot of the sleeping bag, his weight warm, against Tom's legs. Sweet Girl curled against his left side, her purr a gentle vibration against his ribs. And Little Bit ever the climber, found a way to nestle against his shoulder, where she could monitor both her human and her siblings simultaneously. Lying under the star-filled mountain sky with 3 young pumas using him as a living pillow, Tom felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. This was how he would remember them, not as the wild creatures they would become, but as the children they had been, trusting and loving and completely present in each moment. The cold woke him several times during the night, but each time he found the cubs had adjusted their positions to maintain contact without causing discomfort. They seemed to understand, in the way that animals sometimes do, that this night was different from all the others, that tomorrow would bring change they couldn't prevent or understand. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. The cubs stirred as the first grey light filtered through the enclosure, stretching and yawning, but remaining close to their human, rather than immediately demanding breakfast. They seemed subdued, perhaps picking up on emotional cues that Tom couldn't hide despite his best efforts to maintain normal routines. Dr. Martinez and her team were scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock. That gave Tom 4 hours for final preparations, final moments, final memories that would have to last whatever time he had left on Earth. 4 hours to say goodbye to the only family he'd had in 20 years. 4 hours to let go of the creatures who had saved his soul and taught him to love again. 4 hours to prepare for a loneliness deeper than anything he'd experienced during his 2 decades of self-imposed exile. But also 4 hours to celebrate what they'd accomplished together. 3 orphaned cubs raised to health and strength, ready to begin the journey toward their rightful place in the wild. A broken man given purpose and peace in his final months. A love so complete it could survive even the letting go. It would have to be enough. The morning passed in a blur of forced normalcy and barely controlled emotion. Tom fed the cubs their usual breakfast, maintained their regular routine, and tried to act as if this were just another Saturday in the mountains. But his hands shook as he prepared their bottles, and more than once he found himself standing motionless in the middle of simple tasks, overwhelmed by the weight of impending loss. At 9 o'clock, he sat at his kitchen table with 3 sheets of paper and a pen that felt impossibly heavy in his fingers. The letters he'd decided to write, one for each cub, were perhaps the most important documents he'd ever compose. Not because anyone would ever read them aloud to 3 wild predators, but because he needed to say the words, needed to put his love and hopes and fears into something tangible that might somehow survive beyond this moment. The first letter was addressed to Big Boy, though he'd never learned the cubs' actual sex and had simply chosen names that reflected their personalities rather than their biology. Dear Big Boy, by the time you're old enough to understand territory and dominance and what it means to be a mountain lion, you won't remember the man who raised you from a newborn. That's as it should be. But I want you to know that in your first 2 months of life, you were loved completely and unconditionally. You were always the brave one, the first to explore new spaces, and the last to back down from challenges. That courage will serve you well in the wilderness, but remember that sometimes the strongest predators are those who know when to retreat. Your mother was smart enough to bring you to someone who could help. Make sure you inherit her wisdom along with her strength. I hope you claim a territory as magnificent as you are. I hope you find a mate who appreciates your confidence and raises cubs who have your fearless spirit. And I hope that somewhere in your genetic memory you carry a tiny piece of the peace you brought to a broken old man in his final months. Be wild. Be free. Be everything you were born to be. Love always, Thomas Briggs. The second letter was for Sweet Girl, whose intelligence and grace had reminded him daily that predators could be gentle as well as fierce. Dear Sweet Girl, you were the thinker among your siblings, the one who watched and calculated before acting. That patience and intelligence will make you a formidable hunter and, I hope someday, a wonderful mother. I watched you learn to climb with deliberate precision, saw you test every branch before trusting it with your weight. That caution will keep you alive in a world that doesn't always appreciate predators. But don't let wariness steal your joy. Some of my happiest moments were watching you discover new games and perfect new skills with such obvious delight. Your mother chose well. When she brought you here, she must have sensed that you would need someone who understood that strength and gentleness aren't opposites, but partners. I hope you remember that as you navigate the complex world of wild spaces and dangerous humans. May your territory be rich with prey and safe places to rest. May your cubs inherit your wisdom and your grace. And may you always trust your instincts. They've already saved your life more than once. With love and respect, Thomas Briggs. The third letter was the hardest to write because Little Bit had been his miracle. The tiny fighter who'd almost died in her first week, but had grown into the most determined of the three. Dear Little Bit, you came into this world fighting for every breath, and you never stopped fighting. When your siblings were strong, you were stronger. When they were determined, you were more determined. Size never mattered to you, only heart. That fighting spirit will be your greatest asset in the wild. Mountain lions face challenges every day that require not just physical strength, but unshakable will to survive. You've already proven you have that will in abundance. I hope the mountains treat you kindly, but I know that even if they don't, you'll find a way to thrive. You've already overcome impossible odds. You've already shown that being smallest doesn't mean being weakest. Remember that your mother trusted a stranger with her most precious gifts. Remember that love sometimes means letting go. And remember that somewhere in these mountains, a dying man spent his last good months learning to hope again because of 3 small orphans who needed him. You saved me as much as I saved you. Thank you for that gift. Forever your friend, Thomas Brigsby. The time he finished writing, tears were streaming down his face. The second time in 20 years he'd cried. Both occasions connected to these cubs who'd somehow cracked open the shell he'd built around his heart. He folded each letter carefully and sealed them in envelopes marked with the cubs' names, knowing they would never be opened but needing to complete the ritual anyway. At 9:45, he heard the rumble of vehicles coming up the mountain road. Dr. Martinez had arrived with her team, bringing professional transport cages and the expertise to safely relocate 3 young predators who'd spent their entire lives in human care. The sedation process was swift and professional, but watching it felt like witnessing his children being put to sleep for surgery. Dr. Martinez's assistant prepared 3 syringes with carefully calculated doses, while the second team member positioned the transport cages for easy loading. The cubs, still unaware that anything unusual was happening, continued their normal Saturday routine of exploring and playing. Big Boy was first, approached with the quiet competence of people who understood predator behavior. The dart gun was unnecessary at close range. Dr. Martinez simply waited for the right moment when he was relaxed and distracted, then administered the sedative with a quick injection that caused only momentary confusion. Within minutes, Big Boy's movements became sluggish, his confident swagger replaced by the unsteady gait of approaching unconsciousness. "He'll be fine," Dr. Martinez assured Tom as they gently guided the sedated cub into his transport cage. "The drug is specifically designed for large cats. He'll wake up in a few hours feeling perfectly normal, just in a new place." Sweet Girl and Little Bit followed in quick succession, their smaller sizes requiring adjusted doses but the same careful procedure. Watching them succumb to the sedative, their bright intelligence fading into peaceful unconsciousness, was one of the hardest things Tom had ever witnessed. Worse than combat, worse than his son's funeral, worse than the day Mary Ellen moved out with her suitcase and her broken heart. But as the team loaded the 3 cages into their specially equipped transport vehicle, something unexpected happened. Dr. Martinez's assistant called out from beside the truck, his voice sharp with surprise. "Dr. Martinez, you need to see this." She hurried over to where he was examining something attached to one of the transport cages. a small collar that had apparently been hidden beneath Sweet Girl's thick fur and only discovered during the loading. In process, "It's a research collar," Dr. Martinez said, her tone shifting from professional calm to excitement. "See these markings? This is from the Colorado State University Puma research project." She carefully removed the collar, studying the small electronic device and the identification numbers etched into its surface. "These cubs aren't just orphans, Mr. Briggs. Their mother was part of an ongoing study tracking puma populations and movement patterns in this region." Tom felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "What does that mean?" "It means everything," Dr. Martinez said, already reaching for her phone. "If their mother was collared and being tracked, then these cubs are documented offspring of a research animal. That changes their legal status completely." While she made calls to various agencies and research institutions, Sarah moved closer to Tom, her expression reflecting the same confusion and cautious hope he was feeling. "The mother Puma you freed from that trap," she said slowly. "She was wearing this collar." "I never saw a collar," Tom replied, "but it was getting dark, and I was focused on the trap mechanism and her injuries. If it was hidden under her winter coat—" "The collar must have come off during birth," Dr. Martinez interrupted, ending her phone call with obvious satisfaction. "It happens sometimes with pregnant females. The birthing process can dislodge tracking equipment, but this collar proves that these cubs are legitimate subjects of ongoing wildlife research." The implications began to sink in as she explained the complex web of regulations surrounding research animals. The cubs weren't just illegal wildlife being kept by a mountain hermit. They were documented offspring of a study animal, which placed them under different legal protections entirely. "What happens now?" Tom asked. "Now everything changes," Dr. Martinez said. "Instead of rehabilitating illegally captured animals, we're caring for orphaned research subjects. The Colorado Division of Wildlife will still want them relocated to our facility, but as part of the official study protocol rather than as confiscated illegal pets." More importantly, the research collar's discovery meant that wildlife officer Morrison's investigation would take a very different direction. Instead of prosecuting Tom for illegal wildlife keeping, the authorities would be interested in learning about his care methods and the cub's development under human supervision. "You're not in trouble anymore," Sarah said, the relief evident in her voice. "In fact, you might be considered a conservation hero, the man who saved 3 orphaned research subjects and raised them successfully to transfer age." But Tom found no comfort in this unexpected legal reprieve. The cubs were still leaving. His time with them was still ending. The collar might have changed their official status, but it didn't change the fundamental reality that these young predators belonged in the wild, not in his mountain cabin. If anything, knowing their mother had been a research subject made their eventual release more certain. These weren't random orphans of unknown parentage. They were documented individuals whose genetics and territory preferences were part of a larger scientific study. Their successful return to the wild would contribute valuable data to conservation efforts. "The research project maintains detailed records of all study animals," Dr. Martinez said. "Once these cubs are released, they'll likely be fitted with their own tracking collars. Their movements, territory establishment, and breeding success will be monitored for years, so someone will know if they're okay. Someone will know everything about their adult lives, where they go, how well they hunt, whether they successfully establish territories and raise cubs of their own. The data they provide will help protect habitat for future generations of mountain lions." As the transport vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, carrying away the 3 most important creatures in Tom's world, he found himself holding 2 pieces of paper that represented dramatically different futures. Dr. Martinez's business card, with its promise of continued connection to the cubs' welfare and meaningful contribution to conservation science, and buried in his pocket, the medical diagnosis that reminded him he had perhaps months to see how this story would end. The cubs were safe and on their way to proper care. The mother Puma's research collar had transformed Tom from a criminal into an accidental conservationist whose methods would be studied and replicated. But standing in his empty yard, looking at the enclosure that would never again echo with the sounds of young predators at play, Tom understood that legal vindication couldn't heal the ache of separation. 6 months later, the first photograph arrived in Tom's mailbox on a Tuesday morning in late September. The envelope bore the letterhead of Wild Canyon Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and inside was a single image that stopped his breath. 3 magnificent young pumas lounging on a rocky outcrop, their golden coats gleaming in the autumn sunlight. He recognized them immediately, despite their transformation from the cubs he'd raised. Big Boy had grown into the massive predator Tom had always known he'd become, his broad shoulders and confident posture marking him as a natural alpha. Sweet Girl showed the lean grace of an efficient hunter, her intelligent eyes alert to her surroundings even in repose. And Little Bit, his fighter, his miracle, displayed the compact strength of a survivor who'd never learned to quit. On the back of the photograph, Dr. Martinez had written in careful script, "Released successfully into the Sangre de Cristo wilderness area." All 3 showing excellent hunting skills and appropriate wariness of humans. Your foundation made this possible. Tom sat on his porch, holding the photograph with hands that shook from more than just the cancer treatments he'd finally begun. The chemotherapy wasn't going to cure him. The disease had progressed too far for that. But it was buying him time, allowing him to see this moment he'd wondered if he'd live to witness. The cubs were free. They were wild. They were exactly what they were meant to be. Sarah found him there an hour later, the photograph still clutched in his fingers and tears streaming down his weathered face. She'd been coming by twice a week since the cub's departure, officially to check on his medical needs, but really because she understood that some kinds of grief required witness. "Good news?" she asked, settling into the chair he'd placed beside his own after realizing that solitude, while necessary for healing, didn't have to mean total isolation. "The best," Tom replied, handing her the photograph. "They made it. They're wild and free and living the lives they were born to live." Sarah studied the image with the same careful attention she'd always given his cubs. "They look magnificent and happy, if such a thing is possible to judge from a photograph." Dr. Martinez sent updates every month during their rehabilitation. Each report was the same. Excellent progress, strong hunting instincts, minimal human dependence, but seeing them like this, actually living free in their own territory, his voice broke slightly. "It's more than I dared hope for." The past 6 months had been the strangest of Tom's life. The cancer diagnosis had forced him to leave his mountain retreat more frequently than he had in 20 years, traveling to Pueblo for treatments that left him sick and weak, but determined to fight for whatever time remained. The cub's departure had left a silence in his cabin that no amount of familiar routine could fill, but there had been unexpected developments too. The Colorado Division of Wildlife had indeed contacted him about documenting his rehabilitation methods. What began as a simple interview had evolved into a detailed case study that was now being referenced by wildlife experts across the country. His techniques for hand-raising orphaned predators while maintaining their wild instincts had apparently filled a significant gap in rehabilitation literature. More surprisingly, he'd been invited to consult on other orphaned predator cases. 3 times in the past 6 months, he'd traveled to various wildlife facilities to advise on the care of cubs whose circumstances echoed his own unexpected experience. Each time, he'd shared what he'd learned about the delicate balance between providing necessary care and preserving essential wildness. The work had given his remaining time a purpose he'd never expected to find. Instead of dying alone as a forgotten hermit, he was contributing to conservation efforts that would outlive him by decades. The cubs he'd raised had become more than just 3 rescued orphans. They'd become ambassadors for their species, proving That careful human intervention could successfully return predators to the wild. There's something else, Sarah said, reaching into her bag to withdraw another envelope. This came to the clinic today, addressed to you. The return address was from Colorado State University's Wildlife Research Division. Inside, Tom found official documentation that made him blink in disbelief. An honorary appointment as a consulting specialist in predator rehabilitation, complete with a small salary and access to research facilities. They want to name a scholarship. After you, Sarah explained, the Thomas Briggs Fund for Orphaned Predator Research. Students studying wildlife biology would receive grants to develop better rehabilitation protocols. Tom stared at the documents, struggling to process this transformation from hermit to conservation pioneer. I just tried to keep 3 cubs alive. I didn't set out to change anything. That's what makes it meaningful, Sarah replied. You didn't do it for recognition or scientific advancement. You did it